Welcome to our book club channel. We are joined today by Rachel, who writes under the name of Eliza Andrews, and she's written an epic lesbic fantasy called as the Chronicles of Dorsa. We have got like 2 books of the trilogy published so far, and she's also written a new zombie apocalypse book called Bigger Monsters. So welcome, Rachel. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So to start off, I'd just like to talk to you about your new book. It's something very different. You don't see a lot of zombie stories in lesfic. So what was the inspiration behind writing that book, and what's it all about?
Well, I started to, let me take a step back. I'm like a huge Walking Dead nerd. I've been a huge Walking Dead fan for years and years and years. So I love The Walking Dead, but I didn't plan to write a zombie novel. It happened because I have a Patreon page. Every month I write original short fiction for my Patreon members. And a lot of times I let them give me like a prompt to get me started. And so they gave me, this was back in November, they gave me a few prompts, and I just started kind of just free writing it. And the 3 prompts they gave me was, number 1, your characters wake up in the woods, like in the snow dusted woods, and their hands are tied behind their back. And all they have is a knife to cut themselves free. That was the first prompt. And then the second prompt was, your characters are sleep deprived. Why? And then the third prompt was, it's your wedding day and you just found you're making out with your fiance. And so those were the 3 prompts. And I thought, oh, it's a zombie novel. So it's probably just my Walking Dead kind of influence subconsciously combined with those 3 prompts. And I didn't mean to write a novel. I had planned to write, like I said, it was supposed to be short fiction. So I thought I was going to write just a quick and dirty short story. And instead it kept going and going and going. I was like, oh, I'm writing a novel. So, I mean, for me, it's a short novel considering how long my novels are, but but it came out as a novel. So there you go. That's kind of how it happened.
That's very interesting. Speaking of new novel, where do you draw your inspiration from in general for any books?
I mean, I get, it depends on the book. I think for me, I tend to start like different authors kind of start in different places. Some authors start with like a plot idea. Some authors start with a setting, especially like in fantasy. Authors might start with a setting or like a particular story universe that they want to build. I think for me, I tend to start with character. I tend to find a character that I want to about and build a story around. And so that it generally starts more with character, and then everything else comes in after character, rather than the other way around. I mean, the zombie I just described to you, a very different sort of situation. That was specific, but usually for me, it ends up more starting with character. So I don't know if that's kind of a complete answer in terms of where do I get my inspiration, but that's kind of where stories begin for me, are with characters in situations, and then everything else comes to play kind of after that. So
Is that how Dorsa started as well?
Kind of. I've told this story before in other places, but so you may already be familiar with it. But for me, like the way Prince Dorsa started is that I was watching Game of Thrones over the summer a few years ago. I think like 2017. And yeah, 2017. And I'd already, of course, I had the books way before, like years before the shows came out on HBO. But I was binge watching the series, and I was on the phone with my girlfriend one day, and I was saying, and we were talking about queer representation in Game of Thrones and how Game of Thrones, I mean, George R.R. Martin, like, nobody kills characters off like that man. He likes to kill characters for sure. But, you know, I was just saying to her that there's kind of no, you know, I don't know how familiar you are. I'm sure you're very familiar with like the bury your gays trope in fiction.
Yeah,
where you have, there's always like the tragic gay who ends up dying or something horrible happens to them where nothing good ever comes about. And I was saying, you know, in Game of Thrones, there are like no happy endings to any queer stories, you know, for any queer characters. Like they're all, they all have like really tragic endings. And it's not entirely fair to blame George R.R. Martin for following a bury your gays trope, because like I said, he kills everybody. He's pretty indiscriminate. But, you know, it occurred to me that as like a longtime fantasy fan, I couldn't remember, you know, I couldn't remember a storyline where you had queer characters sort of at the center instead of as side characters. And I'm sure some of your listener viewers are going to be, oh, contraire, you know, like I can do 10 books, you know, but, you know, I, especially not like in mainstream fantasy. And so I started talking to my girlfriend when we were having that phone conversation, like, wouldn't it be cool if there was like a lesbian version of Game of Thrones, you know, where it was like you have a queer female character who is the lead character and tragic side character. And she was like, yeah, like I'm sure people would be into that for sure. And I was like, I don't know, like, at the time I had written only 3 lesfic novels at that time, and they were all basically romances. And I was like, I don't know, like my readers know me as a contemporary romance writer. Know that I make the shift to fantasy, I think I'll lose all my readership. And she was like, no, you're wrong. Like, you're going to find a big audience for it. And so I was like, well, you know, maybe I'll take a risk. And then we got onto some sort of side, like flirty side conversation about princesses and bodyguards and these sorts of things. And that's kind of how those kind of the 2 protagonists of the stories were born, was in a phone conversation on the middle of a tennis court, you know, about Game of Thrones and my binge watching of Game of Thrones. So that was how that series started.
Well, I'm glad you took the jump. So you
Yeah,
now have had the
me
books.
too.
Definitely.
Me too. Well, I mean, for me, it's funny because I don't read romance. Like, I've never been a romance reader in my whole life. I've always been more of like a sci-fi fantasy sort of nerd. So I was really happy when I started writing fantasy and found an audience for that. Because it's like, I feel much more comfortable as a fantasy writer than as a romance writer. So
it's your fantasy world. It's probably part of the answer is Game of Thrones, but why did you choose to make it so hard for all of your characters that are not white cis rich men?
I want to, you know, it's interesting because I've gotten criticism for this from some quarters, and I didn't want to write some sort of perfect world in which our problems and our world don't exist. I wanted the protagonist to be a man's world, and struggling against that sort of, she's supposed to, like, in Prince of Dorsa, where the point of view character is Tasia, really felt like Tasia is this character who all that's ever been expected of her is to pop out babies, and she's never been seen as really anything more than a baby factory to, like, make them future emperor, empress, and I wanted her to be in that situation where she's struggling against that, and is menaced by the men in the story and stereotyped in the story as a spoiled princess, which in some ways lives up to the stereotype at the beginning of the book. But I wanted to show that. And I feel like one of the things that's powerful about fantasy and science fiction is you can talk about problems in the real world metaphorically, and you can look at those problems with a bit of space and a bit of perspective, and maybe relate to or learn from something, from these characters in this situation, learn from something from them that can be applicable to our real world. And the same with Jocelyn, I've always been a writer who is interested in writing about race, and interested in writing about racism in all the different kind of, and also like homophobia as well. So, with Jocelyn, this is like with I want her to have to face that sexism and the sort of stereotypes and the way she was, that her voice was silenced as a woman. I wanted Jocelyn to be dealing with racism and classism, and homophobia as well, kind of the triple whammy. She's a woman of color. She's a masculine center gay woman, and, she comes from poverty. And I wanted that to be part of her story and part of, like, how she loved. And it's funny, like, I've read critics who are like, I did this male-dominated world, like, it looks like our world. And I know it looks like our world, like, that's the point. It's supposed to look like our world. I wrote a review of Priory of the Orange Tree.
Oh, I love that book.
Okay, I read Priory of the Orange Tree, I don't know, 6 months ago, maybe 5 months ago. When I started reading it, I'm like, oh my God, it's my book. It's just much better, But one thing that author, that author does some really interesting things in terms of all the characters who are in the highest position of power are women in that book. And I think it's I think all the characters are people of color, shades of color. And I think, and I appreciate what she did. That's fine. But that wasn't the world I wanted to create. I didn't want that world. I wanted characters who had to struggle with that. And I wanted it to have some parallels to the real world. And in a way, like, I feel like it's disingenuous for me as a white woman to write an all brown world, an all black and brown world. Like, to me, that feels a little, I don't know, like dishonest somehow, or like gimmicky. And so for me, I didn't feel like that was a choice I wanted to make. So it's a very hetero world. It's a racist world. It's a very sexist world, but that's all very intentional. Like, I wanted those characters, those struggles. So anyway, that's my answer to that. I'm glad you asked because it comes up.
Speaking of Jocelyn and Tasia, they show a lot of growth, right? From book one to book two, there's a lot of growth for those characters. So, can you tell us a little bit about book three? Give us a sneak peek. Are we going to see further growth? I mean, I know the book three is called Empress of Dorsa, so there's a hint there.
Oh, that's a great question. So, as the third book has been evolving, and just to give you a sense of where I'm at with that book right now, book one is about 136,000 words. Book two is at just over 2,000 words. Right now, I've written 141,000 words of book three. I think it's going to be at least as long as Dorsa.
That's good news for me.
So it's going to be at least as long as book two, but I'm doing something kind of risky, and I think some readers are gonna hate me, and I accept that. But book three, it has 4 different point of view characters, and I'll tell you some of the point of view characters, but I'll leave the others for a surprise. So 2 of the point of view characters are people we know already. So Jocelyn is a major point of view character in book 3. Lynn, who is a character introduced in book 2, becomes a point of view character in book 3. She has a more prominent role to play in the third book. And the other 2 characters are brand new characters you have not met before. So they don't exist in the prior 2 books. I don't want to say that there's definitely character growth within Jocelyn and Tasia in book 3, but it's not as I guess prominent. It's not as big of a part of the story as it is in the first 2 books. Book 1 is really about Tasia kind of growing into a decent human being and a leader. Book 2 is a lot more about Jocelyn and kind of her evolution. But it also shows Tasia kind of learning to stand on her own 2 feet without Jocelyn there to support her. But also in the first 2 books, like, their relationship is very new, and they're in a little bit of a honeymoon phase. They're falling in love in those 2 books. Well, in book 1, they're falling in love. In book 2, they have to put things on pause for a little while. But when we get to the end of book 2, they've been together less than a year, like a matter of months. It's 2 really damn long books, but in story universe time, like, it's not even a year. It's been a matter of months, and they're still very fresh in their relationship. And book 3 is a lot more like, we ain't in the honeymoon anymore, and we're gonna have to, like, face some hard facts and some realities that may not be pleasant to deal with. And so the growth that you see in those 2 characters in particular is really more about them kind of getting out of the honeymoon phase of their relationship and kind of dealing with kind of the difficult circumstance that they're in, because they are in a difficult circumstance. They're in a closeted relationship. You have people very different class standings and very different power standings, after the book 3. And so that's definitely gonna produce friction within their relation that they're gonna have to face and deal with. But to be honest, that is not part of the story. Almost kind of more of a backdrop to the story. It's very different from the other 2 books, I'll tell you that. again, like, I know some of my readers are going to hate me, and that's okay. It happens when you write books, especially when you write sequels. When you write the first book, everyone loves it because they don't know and they haven't formed any opinions about anybody. But by the time you get in the second book, everybody has a different idea of where the characters should go and where the story should go. And book 2 is about fleshing out those two main characters, their backstory, and also the story universe at large. You don't really see that as much in book 3. But there is a kind of funny timeline going on. So I'll stop there.
So is book 3 going to be the last in the Dorsa world, or do you think you'll ever come back and revisit the world?
It'll be the last in that series, but there will definitely be more books within that story universe. I have a prequel series that I already started that goes way back in time to, every now and then the Empress Adela gets mentioned within these 2 books. So the prequel series goes back like hundreds and hundreds of years, and picks up a different character in a very different time. So that'll come eventually, but I just gotta get through the 3rd book first. So yeah.
What's your favorite thing about writing a book? Is it the first draft, the editing? What's your favorite part?
Oh, editing is terrible. Maybe there are people out there who love editing, but I can't stand it. My favorite part about writing a book, I guess it goes back to, for me, it goes back to character. I feel like I've been reading Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. Something I've noticed as I read other fantasy authors is I think I tend to be more character oriented. And so I think the evolution of a character is what's most interesting to me as a writer, in terms of like, what do I enjoy about writing a novel? I enjoy building character voice and kind of seeing how, you take a character and then you drop them in a certain set of circumstances and watching them navigate those circumstances. I think that's interesting to me. And I like doing that. And I like the process of trying to, play, for example, like, in a way, it's harder to write character voice when you're writing in 3rd person as opposed to 1st person. And 1st person can be, because you get a much more intimate view of your character if you're writing in 1st person. You can't do that if you're writing in 3rd person. So like figuring out like how to create characterization with constraints of 3rd person. Jocelyn, for example, makes more references in portions of her point of view sections. She's talking about deserts, and slaves and, different experiences like that. Tasia comes from a totally different class background. And so she uses different metaphors, different, analogies and things like that when you're seeing the world through her eyes. And it's really interesting to be able to try to do that without like going over top with it, but and also to do it in 3rd person instead of 1st. Like Lost, like every episode is a combination of flashbacks to the present. The flashbacks aren't necessarily in chronological order. Like, I thought that was really cool. Like, I love in Lost. And somehow you don't get tired of the flashbacks, really, even though they're like constantly happening. And so really with Soldier of Dorsa, that was sort of my inspiration for that format of flashbacks, and trying use it in a way that was effective and not too much. So I like playing with things like that in terms of what do I enjoy about writing. Those are the kinds of things that turn me on as a writer.
So, talking about flashbacks, was it hard to keep track of two different timelines?
I've had to be more of a plotter. I did the same thing. The reason the book 3 isn't done yet is because the exact same thing in book 3 that I did in book 2, which is that I wrote in book 2, I wrote 70,000 words and I threw them all away and started. And I did almost the exact same thing in the third book, but it was worse. I was up to 9,000 words and I'm like, this isn't working. And I threw it away. And I had to create, at that point, sit down, make myself stop and create a really detailed outline. Now, am I following that out? But yeah, I mean, that's the thing with fantasy. You have to be really careful once you drop a detail that is like a world building detail. You have to be careful not to contradict that again. So yeah, it's not necessarily my strong suit. So I've had to get better. Yeah.
I've got a question here from one of our viewers. Tiffany, this is for you. Since Dorsa is a land of magic, is that little girl from Tower Dreams a possibility?
In Dorsa, when Jocelyn is in the underground city, this is a little bit spoilery for people who haven't read the second book, but when she's in the underground city, she goes into the Tower of the Smallman, and they basically are testing her to make sure she's there with a good motivation. And they offer her different scenarios of don't you want this? Don't you want that? And one of them is a vision of her and Tasia having children, and living out their life, just a quiet little life on top of a mountain somewhere. I don't think it's really good. I don't think I should answer that because it may or may not come up in the third book. Part of the reason I can't answer is that I have my own thoughts about that scenario, but I also just don't want to answer because I think it'll get resolved in the third book.
Paradise. So Tiffany said,
Yeah, Paradise.
Are you going to revisit Paradise anytime or write something similar to that again?
No, that was definitely a one-time, because that book is it's a novella technically. It's only 20,000 words, 25,000 words. No, that book is it's a queer retelling of the book Genesis. So there's definitely no sequel to the book unless I'm gonna write Exodus or something,
Perfect. What book would you had loved to write yourself? You can steal from any author in the world.
Well, I mean, I already said, the Orange Tree is basically my story, but the writing is so good. It's good writing, and I think of myself as a competent writer. I don't think I'm a terrible writer, but I'm also not going to win a pushcart prize anytime soon. And I think that in certain ways that story is such a good version of my story. It's almost kind of embarrassing, You know who else is an author, a fantasy author that I really, really admire is Patrick Rothfuss, who wrote The Name of the Wind. And just the prologue to the first book, that alone blows my socks off. It's so good that because I mostly read via audiobook. So I remember when I first started that book and I listened to the prologue, I was like, oh my God. And I actually immediately went back and I listened to it again. And then the next time I had my girlfriend in my car, I'm like, dude, you have to listen to this. Listen to this. And I played it for her. And that is some amazing writing right there. So Patrick Rothfuss, The Name of the Wind. And then I also just recently read, have either of you read, what was her name? Tamsin Muir, M-U-I-R. She wrote Gideon the Ninth. It's really good. She's got like this incredible, like, dry sense of humor. It's very British humor. Incredible. Like, it's such a funny book. It's like laugh out loud funny. It's a fantasy novel though, you know, and but it's also a very interesting fantasy. It's about a world of necromancers, and it's actually kind of science fiction because it's set so far, and it's like set way in the future, but so far in the future it may as well be fantasy, sort of like Dune. If you ever read Dune. But anyway, oh my gosh, I love her writing. She's a fantastic writer. I listen to books or read books as much for the writing as for the story. And so I'm always kind of listening with reading with two minds. Like I'm a reader who's just enjoying the story, but I'm also a writer who's trying to learn from a reader. And so those are some writers I've read recently who just knocked my socks off.
Speaking of audiobooks, I've heard so many good things about your audiobooks from, how did you get a chance to choose a narrator? And how does one go about choosing the right narrator? Because you must have a voice in your head. And how do you make sure it matches up with what how the narrator is narrating the story?
I love working with narrators for a few different reasons. Number one, I feel like as an independent author in a sort of obscure genre of lesfic, I'm never going to get to see my books made into like Netflix shows, like it's never going to happen. Well, I never say never, but probably not. So to me, like getting an audiobook produced is like the closest thing I can ever come to seeing my book made into a show. So I like it from that point of view. But also, like, if you get a good narrator, like your narrator is also an artist. They are a different type of artist, but they're also artists, and they bring their art to your work, and it becomes something different. It's not quite your work, and it's not their work. It's something that is kind of greater than the sum of its parts, and that's a really neat process to like watch that unfold. Like my narrator, I've used the same narrator for a few different books. So her name is Liz Seda. She's an actress based out of Los Angeles. And I chose her originally for the book Reverie. That book is set in the Deep South, in the American South. And I needed someone who could do a convincing Southern accent. And the narrator I'd used before told me, she's like, I'm sorry, I can't do a good Southern accent. So I was looking for someone who could. And it's the funniest thing because Liz is a Jerseyite. She's from New Jersey, which is like, couldn't be more different from the American South. But she does like a spot on Southern accent. And so I chose her for Reverie. And she was like, I just feel like Reverie in particular, I personally, if you ask me as the author, I think the audiobook is better than the original book. Like, and I was just blown away by what she brought to Reverie, and really like took character dialogue and character voice and really made it something special. So because I knew she had that ability to be pretty versatile with her accents, she was a natural choice when I started narrating Princess of Dorsa. And I really love the accent that she gave to Jocelyn. Like, it's spot on perfect to me. And I can't accents, like, that's not my thing, but she created different accents for different parts of that story universe that I really like. But what's so interesting to me is, like, her as a narrator has changed some of my characters, you know, which is kind of funny to me, because the way she voiced them has changed how I see my own characters. Like, especially like the character Evrart, who shows up at the very end of the first book, but plays a pretty big role in the second book. Like, the way she voiced him changed how I saw him as a character. And it's funny because I can't get out of her interpretation. Like, she permanently changed that character for me. She made him more like more serious. Like, in my mind, he was a little bit more laid back and a little bit more of a relaxed character, but she voiced him in such a way that he was like this kind of very intense, kind of serious guy. And that's who he became going into the next book, which is fine because he has such a minor role in the first book that changing who he was as a character didn't present a problem, you know. But she definitely has changed. Like, when I write now, I can also hear how she's going to voice the character. And I even put in, there's like a line I just wrote like within the past week in book 3 that I wrote it because I knew how she was going to voice the character and I wanted it to be a little different. So I wrote the line so that she would change how she voices the character.
Why did you choose to write under pen name?
I have like, I write under a pen name because I wanted to keep my writing life separate from my real life. And when I first started writing, I had one reason for separating those two identities. Now I have a new reason because I'm a middle school teacher, and I definitely don't want my middle school kids like reading my books. It's like not a good idea. It's like, these are not rated PG, guys. So that's kind of why I write under a pen name, is just to kind of separate my real life from my writing life.
So in the book club, you talk a little bit about the inspiration behind, introducing the Shadowlands. Would you tell our listeners a little bit more about that?
So the idea behind the Shadowlands, from before I even started writing the book, was I was taking Carl Jung's concept of a shadow self. So Carl Jung, the psychologist, said that we all have the self that we show to the world, and we all have kind of a dark streak that we try to keep hidden or repressed. And Carl Jung says we repress our shadow self at our own peril because it will come out one way or another. And if we're not owning it and integrating that into our conscious lives, then it's going to come out in destructive ways, either destructive towards others or self-destructive ways. And that shadow self is usually like stuff that we are somehow ashamed of, that's like not permissible in mainstream society according to societal norms. And Carl Jung also says, if we can learn to accept our shadow self and bring it into our conscious life, we can mine a whole bunch of power from that self, if we can accept it instead of rejecting it. And so the Shadowlands has always been sort of the idea of what if our shadow self was physically separated from us, not just like mentally repressed, but what if it had one time been a part of human beings and then they somehow physically took out the shadow from themselves, to the point that it created a whole kind of parallel universe. It's like everybody's dark streak in one place, is like what the Shadowlands is. And it's the concept of magic in this world is that if you can connect to that shadow world, you can draw quite a bit of power from it. But it's dangerous. You're playing with fire because it's still our dark side, and if you play too much with that fire, you're going to get burned. And so it's kind of the people who are sort of magic users are not called, of course, in the story, but the people who are essentially magic users are people who can connect to that shadow world without being consumed by it. And so something I wanted the characters to go through is to learn they have to stop rejecting that shadow world and get into a more comfortable relationship with it, where they're working with that shadow world instead of always being at odds with it. So that was the concept.
Just curious to know, what's your ideal writing environment?
Well, because I am a teacher, I write in the morning, early in the morning. So generally, I get up at about 5 and have some coffee, eat some oatmeal, and by like 5:45, I try to be writing by then. And depending on how much school stuff I have going on that day, I might write for 30, 40 minutes, an hour, at most an hour. I can't write with music. I do a little, if the music has no lyrics, I can write, but if the music has lyrics, I get too distracted. I hate taking a day off from like a novel, because when you come back to it, you're like, wait, what? Like, I took like a month and a half off to write the zombie novel. And then I came back to book 3 and I couldn't pick up where I left off. I went all the way back to the beginning because I had to reread to see what was happening before I could start writing again. So it's like very dangerous to leave a novel by itself. Like they get very kind of wild and overgrown if you leave them alone. So
Do you have any advice for new writers?
So starting with what I just said is you have to make writing a habit, like anything else, and doing it every day. One of the women I run a sort of Facebook group of lesfic writers online, and one writer said her daily goal is more than 0 words. And I love that. It's like more than 0 words. That's what you got to do. You just write more than 0 words every day, whether it's a sentence, a paragraph, a page, 1,000 words. You just have to sit down and you have to get over that hump of not wanting to write. You just have to sit down and write. Like there's no other way to do it. You just got to sit down and write. And if you can do that every day, you can write a novel. And then the other thing is you have to turn off the editor in your head. That's not like, that's very common advice, but it's true. Like you can't be a literary critic as you're writing. Like you can be a literary critic after you finish the first draft. Then you can go back and be a literary critic. And like, definitely there are days when I'm starting to write and I can't get the words to come out right. And I know my writing is clunky and bad. And it's just like, you just have to write through it. Because if you stop and you're like, no, I have to write a better sentence than this, then you'll never get past that. You just have to like, okay, today I'm going to write clunky, awkward, ugly writing, and that's how it's going to be. And then hopefully it'll get fixed later, So.
I give you some suggestion, and you just pick the one that fits the best. So this or that, cocktail or mocktail?
Mocktail. I don't drink.
Day or night?
Day. I'm a morning person.
Friends, family, or lover?
Aren't those all really one category?
Nope.
All right, well, for the sake of my girlfriend, I have to say lover.
I think it's a good choice. Club, bar, or restaurant?
Club? Club. I miss dancing.
Don't we all? Theater or cinema?
It's hard too. Theater.
Socks or blankets?
Oh, blankets.
Vanilla or chocolate?
Dark chocolate?
Spicy or mild?
Mild. Definitely mild.
Pen and paper or computer?
Computer.
Music or silence?
Silence.
And that's wrap it.
Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. So, do you have any parting thoughts for your readers?
Just that I'm sorry book 3 is taking so long, and it'll be done when it's done. I am working on it. I assure them that I'm working on it every day.